Since you have a shirt and a jacket, I'm putting a shirt on. But I guess the weather here in Buenos Aires is warmer.
Yeah, I already asked Carla about that, and she said that spring is finally coming after a cold last week. And I envy you. Here, winter is coming.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I like long days. I like long
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Well, I think we can get started. So, welcome to this joint seminar of economic analysis and political science. We have the great pleasure of having Hauke Hartman with us today. And the dynamic is that Hauke will do a presentation of the Bertelsmann's Transformation Index. And the presentation, Hauke, is going to be between 30 and 40 minutes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the questions are, there's going to be the possibility of making questions at the end of the presentation, but I guess you don't have problems with clarification questions while you're presenting.
No.
So if somebody wants to make a question, maybe the best thing is to use this, let's see, reaction, raise hand, and that way, well, I'll say go ahead and you can make the question directly. You can also make questions through the chat, but maybe it's better if it's a direct question. So, and well, that's about it. So thank you all for being here in this presentation, and thank you again, Hauke, for presenting this. It's I'm familiar with the index, and it's really very nice how it gives a picture of the institutional and economic development of the countries. So actually, it's institutional development on economic and political fronts.
Thank you very much.
Institutions.
Thank you very much, dear Jorge. Thank you all for being here today. Thanks for the gracious invitation. And I've just been to Buenos Aires 3 weeks ago. I can tell you I terribly miss the city. So this for me is a very good opportunity also to link up back again to your wonderful city and to hopefully give you a presentation that is sparking some interest. I will share now my my presentation with you, and as Jorge said, I'm very open to questions in between if there are methodological questions and so on. Please just go ahead. What is first of all, I should also say thank you very much for listening to me in English. I am probably world champion in not getting the Spanish language. I tried it 6 times, never got past the subjuntivo, and so believe me, I tried. But the presentation in English is probably better. I thank you all for being so kind to listen to me in English. One of the things I like about my work is that it is working with analyses and with scores. And that is, as you probably all know, not a given in the world of indices. You have a lot of indices that are simply presenting you with numbers. If you look up varieties of democracy, VDEM, wonderful project, then you will only get numbers. When you look up the Economist Intelligent Unit Democracy Index, you get numbers. And good numbers, I assume. But this is not a conversation that starts. This is actually, it's the end of a conversation. Somebody says to you, Argentina has a democracy quality on a 10-point scale of 5.82, whereas Chile has one of 6.23. You can either believe the numbers or you can just leave it. But this is not a conversation, and that is also not a conversation on equal terms. There's a data provider giving you the number, and you are a data recipient. You take the number, you believe it, you integrate it in your own texts, but you don't know the reason why specifically this number was given. This is different with the work that I am doing. We have a qualitative index. I am hugely privileged to work together with an academic network of about 300 country and regional experts in more than 120 countries worldwide. And they write reports for the BTI, 35 to 40 pages reports answering 49 questions. And for each of the questions that are answered, you get a paragraph and you get a number. I'm going to show you later. Then we have a comprehensive index. This is perhaps also very important to mention right in the beginning. There are a lot of indices around that are measuring one single quality. Let's say, for example, how large is corruption perceivedly in your country, as Transparency International does. This is good. This has a very special purpose. BTI is data provider to Transparency International as well. This is fine. Freedom House is asking how free or not free are countries. This is on democracy quality. It's fine, you can do that. But for me, I think it is very interesting to see how the economic and the political sphere influence each other. And when I want to look at the state of development or the state of transformation, I find these two entities inseparable, as USEMA did in integrating also politics and international relations into what was before an economic university. So there's a strong interplay between those two entities. And then comes perhaps the most important innovation that the BTI brings. We are writing about, we are assessing, and we are analyzing the governance quality. And that is something that you can only do if you come from an independent organization that is not relying on funding, that is not diplomatically tied, but that can speak and write and analyze freely, which we can do. The Bertelsmann Foundation, I should perhaps say that, the Bertelsmann Stiftung, as it is in German, is one of the largest think tanks we have in Germany. And it is an offspring of the Bertelsmann Media Company. The Bertelsmann Media Company with Random House, Barnes & Noble, Penguin Books, and so on, with a couple of TV stations, is the third largest media company in the world. So funded by such an organization, we can truly act independently, which is also very important. Then finally, what I would like to mention is this is a normative index. We believe there's a thing like a good society. We believe that democracy is the best way to be governed, and that it has to be based on a strong pillar of rule of law. And we believe that a market economy in itself has to be accompanied by social political safeguards, and it has to be sustainable. So if you do not share these pictures of a good society, you could still use the index, but you don't have to subscribe to the results. But my observation is that you might be thinking you are coming from very different angles. But at the end of the day, nobody wants to be woken up in the middle of the night and arrested without charge. Everybody would like to articulate his or her opinion freely. And there should be freedom to build up one's own shop or enterprise on a level playing field. Quite simply that. We are looking at 137 countries, and we could discuss this for 2 hours, and I would probably change my own opinion 3 times, because we exclude the old OECD countries, those countries that were members of the OECD before 1989. In the expectation that there still would be a transformation path to go for the countries that we are actually looking at. At the same time, I do admit quite readily that Argentina could also benefit from a direct comparison to France, that it would be interesting for a country for another advanced country like South Korea to be also compared to Germany. So this has a little bit of an arbitrary note. On the other hand, I'm tired of all those indices where you would be having something like Finland on the top, and then Denmark, and then the Netherlands, and then Switzerland. I would like to highlight real success stories in the process of transformation. This is really why we are doing this. We would like to compare good practices on an international basis, and these good practices are so much easier to be found if we are looking on countries that have not yet a fully consolidated democracy or a highly advanced market economy with social political safeguards. So this is why we are looking at change management. In Latin America, this means we analyze 22 countries ranging from Argentina to Venezuela. We exclude microstates of less than 1 million inhabitants. This is what I was briefly mentioning, perhaps now a little bit more comprehensively. 3 pillars of analysis. This is political transformation, economic transformation, and transformation management. When we are looking at political transformation, we are looking at the preconditions for democratization. That would be political stability, stateness. We would look at the consolidation mechanisms of a democracy. That would be the stability of democratic institutions and the political social integration, meaning how well are the aspirations, the wishes, the demands of civil society actually transported into the political arena. How big is social capital, what are the interest groups, and so on. And then you have the core Darwinian concept of democracy, the polyarchy represented in political participation with elections, association assembly rights, freedom of opinion, but also the rule of law foundation, going beyond the strict, narrow Darwinian concept in looking at separation of power, the independence of the judiciary, or the protection of civil rights. Likewise, in economic transformation, we are not just looking at the economic performance. We are also not just looking at your stereotypical macroeconomic indicators, which of course we have all integrated in our country reports, like fiscal stability, indebtedness, unemployment, and so on, inflation. But we are looking at the organization of the market. Is the organization free? Is it fair? And we are looking at sustainability and social inclusion. And as opposed to many economic concepts that are implying a prerogative, a primacy of economic development, here these are non-weighted, so meaning that the level of social inclusion is carrying the same weight than the economic performance, for example. When it comes to governance, to assessing the quality of transformation management, we are looking basically at 2 different aspects. The one is does the government carry an authority? And on the other hand, is the government able to act inclusively? So the authority is represented by a government that is able to handle the classic management circle, prioritizing, implementing, learning, monitoring, evaluating. That would be steering capability. But also, is a government able to deal with the resources in a sensible manner? Does it have a good anti-corruption policy? Is it able to coordinate policies between opposing or not actually equivalent political goals into one holistic whole? That would be resource efficiency. And then on the other hand, you would have the inclusion part. Is a government able to de-escalate conflicts, to integrate civil society in a decision-making process? Is it able to foster consensus among the elites? Is it able to exclude anti-democratic veto actors? And then internationally, is it able to cooperate? Is it credible and reliable? Does it keep the contracts, the treaties that it signed? Is it peaceful and cooperative on a regional level? This kind of thing. So all in all, these 17 criteria that you're seeing here, they are subdivided into indicators, and all in all, it would be 49. Jorge, please.
Yeah, just a question. I've always had a problem distinguishing transformation management from the other two. But by what you've just said, it would be more a focus on what the government does, transformation management, while the other two look more at society. Is that the one way
No,
of
not
looking at it?
no, not really. But you're very right in asking that question, because when you see analyses of democratic governance, for example, you would also have included the set of democratic institutions, for example. And that would also be taken in measuring governance. What we would, for example, have among rule of law or political participation, all the institutional setting is located there. Is there separation of powers at all? Are basic rights protected? What we're doing with governance is really the quality of the political actors in putting a political decision-making process into action that is at the same time inclusive. So that would be the actual performance of political actors, as opposed to the institutional setting, which you would find in political and economic transformation. Thank you. So this is what I said. It's subdivided into several questions. Here, just randomly one question. I picked prosecution of office abuse, one part of our rule of law criterion. You will find a description first. What do we mean when we ask to what extent are public office holders who abuse their positions prosecuted or penalized? And then you would find, we measure by a 1 to 10 scale. 1 is really bad and 10 is very good. And also for levels 4 and 7, to keep the equidistance, we add descriptions saying, okay, country expert, when you are looking at this country and when you have written a text that is saying that, no, they are not really prosecuted, but there is at least some awareness of the problem, or the media is covering it, would be more like level 4, 3 or 4. And so they can orientate themselves already on this 10-point scale. There's a larger review process that comes afterwards. I'm going to explain right now. But the important thing here is it is a standardized code book, so all the experts are getting the same questions. So we have 137 country experts that are writing a report and that are attaching the scores to the text that they have written. And we have reviewers that are looking at the text, that are criticizing the text, that are adding information to the text, and which independently, without seeing the first scoring, also offer their scores. If the author of the country reports, if he or she comes from the respective country, then the reviewer would be international. Or vice versa, if the author is international, then the reviewer would come from the country. We would like to have both, the local and the international perspective. And then we have 11 regional coordinators that are looking at the reports, that are consolidating it, in the sense of looking at the report and at the comments, and then write a final version of it, and also give their scores. So this is, so to speak, the second review that is taking place. First the reviewer, then the regional coordinator. And then we come into action. I have a team of 12 highly gifted students that are looking at different indicators and that are checking whether, let's say, banking system, do all 23 countries on level 7 out of 10, so pretty highly scored already, 7 out of 10, do they all have the same share of non-performing loans? Is bank supervision in all of these 23 countries already pretty advanced? Do they all follow the Basel criteria, more or less? And if there's one country among those 23 that is perhaps not performing in the same quality than the other 22 are doing, these students will mark this country for me. They will say, okay, I believe Ghana is not on the same level as Romania. And then we would check that. We would be, me and 2 of my colleagues, and we would have a look at that, and we would say, okay, this is a valid point. The important thing being that while the regional coordinators are only looking inside their own region, we are, with the help of the students, looking now the first time internationally, interregionally, and then see if there's any regional bias in there, then we can iron that out. And then all the regional coordinators, that would be the 1, 2, 3, 4, that would be the fourth step of the review. All the regional coordinators and my team, we are meeting and we are discussing that, all those questions that could not be clarified. And then we have preliminary scores, and they are submitted then to our board, made up of seasoned transformation, governance, democracy experts that are having a look at it again, and they are asking critical questions. And once those questions are answered, then we have final results. So this is a 5-step review process that is, to mention the elephant in the room, that is addressing the question of subjectivity. Because who protects me against the case that the country expert on Indonesia had a really bad breakfast and is in Indonesia in raining season, and he doesn't like the country at the moment because it's humid, it's hot, it's wet, and he's in a bad mood, and he is writing something really nasty in, let's say, freedom of organization. No, I can't be protected against that. This is human. There are biases, there are subjectivities. This is always happening. This is why, first of all, we need a 5-step review process. Because if we are looking at the text again for 5 times, chances are pretty high that we are saying, no, come on. It might be bad in Indonesia. It might have worsened in Indonesia, but it's not really that bad. And so corrections are brought in here. And then secondly, I would argue that all index scores that you will ever get delivered are more or less subjective in nature. The unemployment rate in the United States is hugely arbitrary, depending on whom you include as an unemployed. And in fact, Donald Trump, he excluded a vast number of US American unemployed people by measuring it with a new yardstick. And well, as far as Argentina is concerned, you know how it is when the chief officer of a statistical office is kicked out because he is not delivering the correct information. So I would argue that all information that you're receiving has at least a grain of subjectivity in there. But we are very aware of that, and we try to filter it out. And for the most time, I think quite successfully. So I prepared a couple of slides for you that I had not shown when I was in Buenos Aires 3 weeks ago, because I think you as students and professors might be able to benefit from getting a little bit more introduced to what we are having. Those are the country reports. This is how it looks like. The text goes on down there, but this is Brazil, freedom of expression. You see, this is 6 points. You see the spark line. You see references to other indices that we are also putting in here. This is the texts that you can use. This is the numbers that you can use. You can access all disaggregated 7,124 scores. You can rank them according to criteria or indicator or what have you. You can also access the historical scores. So you are also able to go to you could actually say, I would be interested in to learn more about how does the BTI evaluate, the BTI 2018 evaluate prioritization, implementation, and policy learning under the Kirchner government, or in the BTI 2020 under the Macri government, or in the BTI 2022 under the Fernandez government. And then you could draw a comparison, and you could also say, do I agree with it or not? You could say either I do not agree with the text, I would like to argue about the text, or you could say I agree with the text, but the score seems weird when I compare it to another text. This is a kind of discussion that makes it possible. And then we have fancy visualization tools. I just show you here a screenshot from what happens when you compare Argentina to Brazil, and you see Argentina is doing better politically and Brazil is doing better economically, in a nutshell. And as far as governance is concerned, consensus building and international cooperation is so much better in Argentina than it is in Brazil. But we have also world maps, we have correlation analysis, we have timelines. You should check it out. This is one of the tools that we are offering. We have a book, we have an online presence, we have a ranking, we have the country reports, we have regional analyses, and as I mentioned, we have this interactive visualization tool, our Transformation Atlas. So this is to tell you, where do I come from? This is the BTI, this is, and the results I'm going to present to you now are based on this kind of instrument. I make a quick cut here to ask you if there are any questions of understanding. If there's anything that is unclear that I should answer at that point. Otherwise, there will be time, of course, afterwards also. That not being the case, I proceed to the results. So this is actually why you're here. You want to learn more about the global trends. And one of the decisive global trends is democracy erosion worldwide, current and historic also when you look back the last almost 20 years. This is the world map according to the BTI, but it does not really differ that much from, let's say, Freedom House or other maps. The blue ones are the democracies, the purple ones are the autocracies, the red ones are the failing states. And you see that there are two predominantly democratic regions in the world. This is Europe and this is Latin America, which is why I don't understand that regional cooperation is not larger between the regions, but that's of course another discussion. But you see that during the last 16 years, this was our first BTI 2006, there is a decided trend of democracy erosion. And starting really in 2008, when the democracy indicators went down, to be looked at in conjunction with the global economic and financial crisis. I'm sure this is not independent from each other. It's on the other hand also, of course, not deterministic. But the drivers of this development, the erosion of participation rights, the erosion of rule of law, come from all segments of quality. The formerly stable democracies with increasing political deficits, democracies that have slipped into authoritarian patterns of rule, like Turkey, for example, and hardening autocracies, countries like the Gulf states or Russia that reacted against rebellions like the color revolutions, the Euromaidan, the Arab Spring, and so on. This is affecting all democracy core criteria to a larger or lesser extent. Dramatically, association and assembly rights, so kind of the basic rights. You can go out on the street and you can demonstrate, or you can form your own union, went down most decidedly, but basically all democracy core indicators went down. Broken down by regions, I mentioned already, Europe and Latin America are the most democratic ones, but only Asia and post-Soviet Eurasia did not lose dramatically in democracy quality. All the other regions did, most dramatically possibly Europe and Southern and Eastern Africa. When we look at Latin America, we see a downward trend as well, from close to 7 points on a 10-point scale to the upper sixes. This is, of course, still way above the global average, but the most pronounced criteria trends during the last 2 years were further restrictions on political participation, on rule of law, and an erosion of the stability of democratic institutions. And those are the same that also would apply on a 10-year scale. The decline of formerly stable democracies is probably a particularly painful point to look at. I would like to mention Poland, Bulgaria, Brazil, Hungary, India, and Serbia. Those are the countries that we formally consider to be in a process of consolidation, whereas in fact they are not. Our neighbors in Poland and Hungary particularly give us a lot of headaches in the European Union. Your neighbor Brazil probably gives you also a lot to think about. India is a drastic case of a country that is turning ultra-nationalist and very exclusive as far as the Muslim minority is concerned. You are quite familiar, I would suppose, with how it is to deal in a polarized political setting. What makes it more problematic is if this is really an us versus them agenda. And we have often witnessed, and we saw that in the US actually also, even though not being part of the index, but we saw it in the US and Brazil and Hungary, in Turkey, and in a lot of other places. This is not just about winning an election. This is getting the mandate to fulfill the people's will. This is a revolution at the ballot boxes. This is how it is declared to be. And if a new government instrumentalizes such a rhetoric, it automatically turns anti-pluralistic. It denies opposition and minority groups the right to speak out and to present counter-argument. The governments like that, governments like in Hungary, took themselves to the right to undermine the judiciary, to muzzle the media, to hinder civil society in organizing and demonstrating. It then went on with manipulating elections, and like in the Hungarian case, 50 articles were added to the constitution that can only be overturned with a 2/3 majority. So that they tried to set their own conservative, ultra-conservative course for the generations to come. So what we witnessed is an intensive polarization, not that much on the level of civil war or widespread violence, more on the level of a moderate conflict intensity, like pronounced conflictive polarization. One of the reasons is if you cannot really participate in the economic life, if you're excluded economically, then you will lose confidence in the state, and you will turn more to your own identity groups, clan-based, ethnic, religious, and so on. This is what we've seen a lot in a lot of places in Africa. And by having a free and fair market organization, I'm not really talking about, is a foreign investor free and fair to invest in that country? Yes, that's also not unimportant, but more important, if I'm a small shop owner, can I, living in Beirut, can I open a shop at the other side of town? Can I do that? If I'm living in Kazakhstan, could I invest in the oil sector? And in both cases, the answer would be no, you cannot. You're either forbidden religiously or on religious grounds or on state security grounds. And this is why we highlighted quite a couple of countries in red. Most of these countries, 46 out of 50, are autocracies. The large scandal has always been and continues to be that the number of people that are socially excluded is so astonishingly, amazingly high. And so these people are really not only giving not economic opportunity, but they are also denied social participation. We have witnessed in the years of hyperglobalization, we did witness an increase in material well-being in quite a number of countries, China being probably the most prominent one. So poverty in some of the countries was not really eradicated, but it was at least fought quite considerably well. But at the same time, we saw that inequality rose dramatically. Those were wonderful times when the economists could still write in 2010 that in Latin America, genie is back in the bottle, because we had a lot of reform-oriented governments like the PT government in Brazil with the Bolsa Familia program, a lot of other moderate governments to the left, middle left or middle right, that were also looking at social inclusion. This is not possible under the new constraints anymore. And so inequality is rising in all parts of the world and in Latin America, of course, as well. Now with the pandemic, poverty is also on the rise in unprecedented numbers. The pandemic, of course, shook economies worldwide. Those mostly shaken are colored in orange or red here on the map. So you can see most affected was Panama, India, and the Philippines for different reasons. Of course, it was also combined sometimes with bad economic governance. For example, when a lockdown went on just far too long or far too strict, or there was no lockdown at all, or what have you. So in a nutshell, we saw a weakening of consolidated democracies. We saw a rising number of hardening autocracies. This is the depressing state of affairs in the BTI 2022. Quickly turn to governance before I would then close for questions. We see that the integrative aspect, the cooperation aspect, and also the consensus aspect are traditionally the stronger ones in governance, but they declined most decidedly during the last 16 years, speaking for a more conflictive environment, both domestically and internationally. Countries that declined most are mostly right-wing populist regimes like Brazil, Hungary, India, and so on. New autocracies like Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Turkey, or disintegrating states. Mexico is not yet disintegrated, but it's making headway to get there. We saw a steep decline in conflict management quality. In 2006, only 23 out of the then measured 118 countries purposefully escalated conflicts. Today, it is 37. Whereas the number of de-escalating or at least preventing escalation governments shrunk. Now, what I did is I looked at a couple of those democracies that are still democracies, but where democratic quality declined drastically. And I made an average of all of our governance criteria to have a look at what happened with the quality of governance in countries ranging from Benin and Brazil to Serbia and Slovenia. And we see that all of the governance aspects actually declined with the sole exception of policy coordination, but most decidedly in the area of consensus building and of international credibility. There is a myth around, and the myth is actually very much propagated by the Chinese government these days, and that is democracies are not delivering, they are not performing. They are squabbling, they are fighting each other, they are based on interest groups, but they are not fulfilling the will of the people. Would we only be all a little bit more authoritarian, then governance would be better. We would be so much more efficient if there's a strong hand in the government that is leading the cause. BTI results show that this is really nothing more like actually a myth. The steering capability and the resource efficiencies of autocracies, with very few exceptions, and China is not among these exceptions, but Singapore, the Emirates, and Qatar are. But the big rest of the purple-colored autocracies here really perform very, very bad also in terms of policy coordination, of the use of available resources, and anti-corruption policy, basically in every respect. So the average governance performance of the 70 autocracies is on par with Nigeria, and this is a situation you do not wish to be in. It is a corrupt and a rudderless regime that cannot control its own country, that is wasting resources, and that is simply not performing well. I remind you all of the very wise word of Danny Roderick, who said, for every Lee Kuan Yew, for every single Lee Kuan Yew, you have 10 Mobutu Sese Sekos that are ruining their countries because they are highly corrupt, bankrupt, inefficient, and predatory. In terms of democracy, there are only few autocratic countries that have a reliable rule of law. I could call on Kenya or Singapore, for example. But most of the autocracies, of course, suppress freedom, of course, suppress participation right, and have no reliable rule of law to build on. And this is probably the most alarming news to the autocracies. They are performing a lot worse than democracies are doing. The reason why this is so alarming is democracies can build on input legitimacy. These governments are elected. The voters can decide differently next time, but for the time being, they are elected. Autocratic rulers are not elected, so they are dependent on output legitimacy. They have to perform economically and socially well, and if they are not, they are losing every legitimacy. This is bad news for the average authoritarian country to be on the same level as Laos is. What we are witnessing is when autocracies come under pressure, they get more repressive internally, which is a natural move, I would say. But they are also turning more aggressively when it comes to international politics. And this is a lesson that we are learning the hard way in Europe and globally, also with the Russian attack on Ukraine. The Russian regime is bankrupt, more or less bankrupt, and its popularity is going continuously downhill. So they turn to external aggression in order to bolster up the image. This is disturbing, but we will deal with Russia. I'm pretty sure that Putin's days are numbered. It's much more dangerous when we're looking at China and how it might act in the future towards Taiwan. So I end with these absolutely not uplifting words. I'm very aware of that, but I do thank you for your kind attention, and I hope I could mention one or the other thing that is of interest to you and that you would like to discuss with me further. Thank you so much again.
Thanks a lot, Hauke. One of the participants, I think it's Juan Neida, was asking if we can upload your presentation to the webpage. Would that be okay?
I didn't get that acoustically. Could you?
Oh, sorry. If you can send the presentation so we can upload it on the web page.
Oh, absolutely. So, with pleasure. Yes.
Okay, so I'll ask you about that later. And there's a question from Constantino Papalias. I don't know, Constantino, if you want to speak out or do you want me to read it? So whatever you prefer.
Thank you. I prefer for you to read it. Thank you very much.
Oh, great. So I'll read his question. Thank you for sharing your view. Could you give us your opinion on the drivers of the deterioration on metrics? Could some of it be attributed to the analysis being perfectioned instead? And if democratic quality is really declining, could you name one or two silver bullets to revert it, if there are any? Thank you.
Thank you. Very learned questions. Thank you. I like to be challenged in that. You are right in assuming that our assessment quality improved over the years. So that we avoid some mistakes that we did in the early days. That is very right. It does not contribute to a worsening of the numbers. It just makes the assessment more precise. It helps us to differentiate better, but it does not automatically make it worse. It's a super smart question because in the world of indices, this is a common mistake in order to the finer granulated you analyze, the larger the danger is that you are blowing the negative points out of proportion and take the more positive points for granted. In putting measurement levels on the 4 and 7 point points on the 10-point scale, we try to have anchors in which we qualitatively can orientate the measurement. So I would not say this is because of measurement. There is a real deterioration if you're comparing the state of the AKP in Turkey something like 10 years ago, when everybody still thought it would be a model for the combination of Islamic policies with democracy, of the Hindu nationalism that was introduced by the BJP under Narendra Modi. Think of the Workers' Party in Brazil, whatever you want, but Bolsonaro is really hitting the the bottom out of the barrel. We have rule of law, very real rule of law deteriorations in Europe, not only in Hungary and Poland, but most pronouncedly there. So this is a world that has grown more undemocratic. I think this is real. This is not due to measurement, and that's one of the reasons, of course, why we are happy to have the text to go along with the scores, because then you can compare also the qualitative assessments of 10 years ago and today, and then say, perhaps, yes, okay, I can understand why the score went down so decidedly. And no, I cannot give you good examples of solid improvements. I can give you examples of weak improvements in Armenia, in Malaysia, in Tunisia. But those are really very shaky, contested improvements. And in Tunisia, most particularly, we see this, what I mentioned earlier, where the myth of more autocratic governance is really taking a foothold, where presidents, heads of the executive are saying, our democratic institutions are blocking each other. And I don't care anymore. I'm going to cut this Gordian knot of indecisiveness by making the decisions by myself. The Tunisian president sent the parliament home and said, I'm going to rule by decree right now. And you see that in a couple of other places, Benin, El Salvador, Philippines. And so yeah, there we see the very real dangers of this autocratic myth really working. So Tunisia is not a success story, really. But nonetheless, it is at least a country where some of the democratic gains will probably persist. I could envision that. But there's no really, I mean, the most uplifting cases we have in the BTI are really countries that did not lose their positions. I would call Uruguay or Costa Rica or South Korea or Taiwan or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Those are countries that achieved a certain degree of consolidation and have defended it admirably through all the storms that took place in between. And I think the change of government from the Frente Amplio to the conservative Lacalle Pou opposition was amazing, in the sense also of how Lacalle Pou then turned again to the Frente Amplio opposition to integrate them into his own decision-making with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. So those are cases where we would say this is functioning democratic governance, and that's probably the best I can do.
I had a question. Now that you mentioned Turkey, Philippines, and some other countries, I don't know why the image of Peru popped up. It's before the index started, but in the 1990s, Fujimori sent the oh, you said that about Tunisia, sent Congress home. He closed the Congress, called new elections, and population was really, really enthusiastic about him, and he got to control Congress. But I would say that Peru, 20 years later, kind of is a mild success story, even though they have governments like in Italy that 1 year the president is in office, the next he's either was sent home or is in prison. But in a sense, So maybe there's something over the longer term, thinking of the case of Peru, that might also happen to these countries. That was just a reaction that, like a flash I had while you were talking about.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely so. And I mean, believe me, I'm an eternal optimist. I am very, very sure that people at the end of the day will decide for democratic governance. No question about that. Peru had some good governance times. I think the Humala government was probably the best one out of a row of really not so well performing presidents and governments. You could also see turnarounds in Latin America. I forgot to mention Ecuador, for example, overcoming the Correa legacy. Then again, let's see how that develops now in the future. But no, definitely. I think if we have learned one big lesson out of the past 10 years, that is that almost all democracy indicators went down, with one exception, and those were the civil society indicators. So the social and political integration in many countries remained strong, social capital even advanced. And while that might sound not so super important for the core functioning of democracy, it is, in fact, when you're looking at so many different countries. I'm turning now closer to my own home here, but when you're looking at Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia, all countries that were once dominated by very rightist governance that acted very polarizing and very exclusionary, where civil society demanded and succeeded with wanting an opening. And so there was a turnaround during the last couple of years in all these countries that I mentioned. And so to Konstantinos Papalias, this, of course, would also constitute good examples that I forgot to mention. Their quality of governance and their quality of institutions is now back to the same levels it used to be 10 years ago. And I tend to forget that. I tend to overlook that in the meantime, they hit bottom and now raised again for the last couple of years. And that is, of course, a very, very uplifting development, as it is when civil society is getting mobilized in so unfortunate and unlikely places like Sudan or Myanmar or Belarus. It's admirable how civil society gets together in these places. And this is one of the advantages also of the BTI. You don't get to see that measured in other indices that are looking at, let's say, electoral quality, for example, which we do, of course, as well. But the BTI covers these consolidation processes or these civil society participatory processes and measures them as well.
There's a question from Jorge. What could be one of the measures a country can take in order to improve its institutional quality? Thanks.
Oh, I'm very modest when it comes to making recommendations across the board, because I learned very much also from the conversations I was privileged to have in Argentina, for example, but from many other countries that I visited, that the most important reform initiatives mostly are aware on a local level. We know we need, let's say, public sector reform, or we need an education reform urgently. People in Uruguay knew this for many, many years. It was just not initiated, and perhaps now is. But yes, of course, I mean, some really basic things would be have a good anti-corruption policy, one that is really not only written on paper and has a glossy agency for anti-corruption policy, but really do it, really implement it. And sometimes, good example would be Georgia. Sometimes you just start to do it. You just start to monitor all the tax collecting offices, the border tax collecting offices of your country. Or you raise the wages for policemen and women, that they do not have to rely on bribes anymore. You can do things like that. Make your anti-corruption policy work. That's one big thing. The other big thing is stop your country exploding socio-politically. If the gap between rich and poor is just too big, don't be surprised when the disintegrated turn against you at the ballot box. It's absolutely natural. And what I'm witnessing, you are very much closer than I am to your own region, of course, but what I'm witnessing across Latin America at the moment is an implosion of the conservative party spectrum. You do not have a conservative opposition anymore in Colombia or in Chile or in Brazil. You're having right-wing fanatics because if your policy is status quo protection, as it so often was with conservative parties, in times of increasing inequality and poverty, this is radical. This is not just conservative. This is radical. And then the people take the original. They take Cast and Chile or Fernandez, I think was his name in Colombia, or this preacher man in Costa Rica, or Bolsonaro. Stopping the socio-economic divide is of utmost importance. And then one of the ever-present problems in Latin America, of course, would be diversification and increase of productivity. Stop the export-oriented model that is so very much dependent on a stable world market, which we know is not a given, and that has tremendous political repercussions. Many of the democracy erosions we are witnessing in Latin America today can be directly traced back to shrinking levels of well-being.
Hauke, there's another question from Konstantinos.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that there is a chance that investor-driven requirements compel countries to enforce profound transitions in order to capture capital inflows? So this is an economic question.
Yeah. I believe it is, and I don't like it at the same time. Because this is kind of a forced transformation. What we could, I don't have to tell that really to an Argentinian discussion partners, but international investors are not interested in the well-being of a country. They are, if it comes to earning a quick buck, then they are going to do it. This weekend, I'm going to moderate a panel on the debt crisis. And one of the big things that is currently with the common framework of the G20 and the Paris Club and China combined, one of the big things that is missing is, what about private creditors that form more than half of the creditors we have worldwide? What about their responsibility towards the country that they are investing into? But yes, I believe that either window dressing or real reforms are very much progressed by a tendency of investors either believing the change is taking place or not. So the short answer would be yes, but I would very much more prefer to be homegrown. Yes.
If nobody has a question now, I'd like to make you a question that I thought about while you were presenting, because you've been talking about Hungary for a long time. Mm-hmm. I guess, I don't know, 4 years ago, or maybe 6 or 8, you were already concerned about what was happening in Hungary. Now, yeah. I guess your concern has only grown larger, right? Poland, now you're. But unlike Turkey, I think those countries, at least, this is driven by what, or and India perhaps too, this is driven by what voters have preferred. So it's kind of, voters don't seem to care too much about some things that have to do with the normative criterion of a democracy based on rule of law. Maybe even a worse case than, I guess, Orban or Bolsonaro is the case of Philippines, where directly the president became famous for shooting people that he thought were criminals without due process of law, and voters loved it. So that's my question. What, in the end, there's a problem with what people want, because democracy delivers what the median voter wants. So that
Yes, I believe that is very true. There is a very real danger of a popular populist government, one that is polarizing a country successfully over a long period of time, by acting really, if it's not in government, but really still in opposition. So I mean, all the governments that you have just mentioned, they all create their own opposition. Either it's international Jewish conspiracy, like Orban in Hungary says, or there's the Brussels bureaucratic monster, like the Polish government says, or it's the undermining of the state by Muslims, as Modi says, and so on and so on. So there is a very real danger of democracy erosion perpetuating in the spiral that I showed earlier on. You're very right, and there is really no good recipe. There is civil society awareness is one thing that gives hope. I believe that independent, truly independent public media are a huge, big asset. I think one of the killers in Great Britain is really the Murdoch press that pushed the country into Brexit, and then also it would be political education. Really teaching people democratic values. This is a long road, and it's not a really spectacular road, not one that is very shiny, but I think it is a road that is really worth trying or worth going, because yes, we need to convince about that democracy is not just who is getting most votes. But democracy is also about the rights of the opposition, welcoming, embracing the opinion of the opposition, because it makes your own policies better. That would be necessary, and it is. I'm very right. How could I argue with that? As you said, this is not followed in many countries around the globe.
I'm going to ask you two things. One, if you can repeat what you said about Brexit, because I couldn't quite understand it. And then there's another question by Konstantinos. What about distributed autonomous organizations? Can they do the job? If everything is driven by a 50% plus one decision policy, how do you propagate illumination, assuming there is one spread worthy?
I really don't know what distributed autonomous organizations are. I would need help here.
We have to ask Konstantinos, but I think he's at least the other part. Konstantinos, can you elaborate on what you mean by distributed autonomous organizations?
Yes, of course. I'm sorry because I have some noise in the background, but the idea is that through technology, you can have organizations that are backed by internet protocols or distributed protocols that are set beforehand before the organization goes online, and the rules are set in a way that cannot be changed by a single or a small group of individuals. And naturally those organizations thrive online and have been rising next to cryptocurrencies, but do not necessarily mean or stand on a cryptocurrency itself. But the idea is that using technology and using distributed power of individuals that cannot compel the system to force to do something that only a small group of individuals want, can achieve different goals that are set beforehand and so are measurable and do not change over time. Thank you, and sorry for the noise.
No problem. Thank you very much for clarifying. I prefer not to answer because as you said, I have not a spread-worthy answer on that one, and then I better not try to. What I'm understanding, what I'm grasping at the same time is pre-setting goals is difficult because sometimes you might collectively want to decide to change goals, and that still should be possible in the democratic process. But I think the idea behind it is what it is also with independent watchdogs, like let's say an anti-corruption agency, competition policy agency, and so on. Independent organizations that serve to protect against an over-increase of competences and power in the hand of the executive, and that in itself, I think, would be a tendency that I would welcome. And the other thing on Britain, just observing how the media functions there, it's dominated by Rupert Murdoch, and he had a clear "let's get out of Europe" perspective, and the BBC was over the years consciously gutted, destroyed as an independent organization. I mean, politically independent organization. And that is something, for example, what I believe is at the moment a very strong anchor for Germany. We have strong public media that are independent, that are not partisan, that are not automatically supporting the government. And that helps us a lot because 80% of the people you would still ask, what news do you look at? And they would say, well, first or second channel on public television. And that is we could agree on the same facts that are debated in the news. You do not have Fox News on the one hand and CNN on the other hand, because then the discourse is really disrupted.
Well, I guess that if there are no other questions, we're basically done. I have one comment about what Constantino said, because I think that he is including the possibility of reform when he talks about 50% plus one. So a small group can't change the rule, but a bigger group can.
Yeah.
And it also made me think of what you once talked about, not today, about referenda in Switzerland, where the people have a lot more participation than in other countries, right?
Yeah.
It's wonderful in the sense that they not only vote for who's going to govern, but also about policy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
so,
true.
Thank you so much, Hauke. Thank you, everybody that attended the seminar. It's been very interesting, and let's hope things get better.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today. Thank you that you hung out so long with me here together, and I very much appreciate your questions and your kind attention, and hope to be back in person not too far in the future. Thank you, Jorge. So many thanks to you, Carla, also for making that possible. Thank you, and have a good day.